The rain came down softly that evening, painting the streets of Portland in silvery streaks. Through the fog window of a small corner coffee shop, the world looked like a watercolor, blurred, quiet, and tired. Inside, Eleanor sat alone, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea that had long since lost its warmth. The rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the glass echoed her own loneliness. She watched the people hurrying by, umbrellas tilted, faces hidden, all with somewhere to go, someone to go home to. At 52, Eleanor had long convinced herself that love belonged to the young, to those who hadn't been broken by life, who hadn't watched dreams slowly dissolve with time. The years had taken much from her, not just her youth, but the courage to hope again. Her marriage had ended years ago, not with betrayal or shouting, but in silence. Two people simply drifting apart until there was nothing left but polite words and empty rooms. Since then, Eleanor had lived quietly. She worked as a librarian, read stories about love that felt like they belonged to another lifetime, and walked home every evening under streetlights that seemed to burn only for others. She told herself she was fine, but deep inside, she longed for something she couldn't name anymore. That rainy evening wasn't supposed to be special. She was only waiting for the storm to pass before heading home. Yet fate often chooses the ordinary moments to change everything. The door suddenly burst open, letting in a gust of cold air and the scent of rain. A small boy, no more than 7, ran inside, soaked to the bone and clutching a sketchbook protectively against his chest. His laughter filled the quiet cafe for a moment before he was joined by a man, his father, who followed closely behind, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate and wearing an apologetic smile. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with hair dampened by the rain and a gray sweater clinging slightly to his shoulders. When his hazel eyes met Eleanor's for a brief second, she felt an odd flutter in her chest. He smiled softly before guiding his son to the corner table near hers. The boy immediately opened his sketchbook, pencil scattered, sketching with the concentration of a tiny artist lost in his own world. Eleanor tried not to stare, but when she noticed what he was drawing, the coffee shop itself, down to the dripping window, and the lonely woman staring out of it, she couldn't help but smile. The man noticed. He leaned toward his son and whispered something. The boy turned, holding out the page shyly toward Eleanor. "My son says you look sad," the man said gently. His voice was low, the kind of tone that felt safe. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. She gave a small laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm fine," she murmured, though the words didn't feel true even as she said them. The boy's innocent honesty stayed with her long after they turned back to their table. When the rain refused to stop, the man, whose name she later learned was Daniel, offered a simple smile as he sat beside her near the window. His son, Noah, was busy doing dragons now, humming quietly. Daniel told her that he and Noah had moved to Portland only a year ago. He was a widower. His wife, Laura, had passed away 5 years earlier in a car accident. Since then, he'd tried to build a new life from the pieces left behind. As he spoke, Eleanor found herself listening with a kind of focus she hadn't felt in years. Daniel didn't cover his pain with jokes or false cheer. He spoke plainly about love, loss, and how learning to live again was harder than he ever imagined. In turn, Eleanor told him about her quiet life, the books, the solitude, the routine that had become both her comfort and her cage. Their conversation wasn't flirtatious. It was honest. Two souls recognizing something familiar in each other's eyes. Grief, resilience, and a faint spark of wanting to feel alive again. After that day, fate seemed intent on bringing them together. Eleanor began to see Daniel and Noah often. At the park near her home, at the library where she worked, at the same cafe where they'd first met. Noah would always wave enthusiastically, sketchbook in hand. One afternoon, he ran up to her and showed her a drawing, her sitting under a tree, reading, with sunlight falling on her face. She hadn't even noticed him sketching. Daniel smiled and said quietly, "He draws people who make him feel safe." Those words stayed with her all night. Soon, Eleanor found herself joining them on the park bench, reading while Noah played, talking with Daniel about books, about life, about little things that began to matter again. Her world, once gray and predictable, began to bloom with color. She noticed how laughter sounded when it came from the heart, how a simple touch could feel like sunlight, how just sitting beside someone could make loneliness feel miles away. But with every flicker of new joy came an old fear, the fear of losing it. One evening, as Daniel walked her home through the drizzle, she stopped at her doorstep and said quietly, "I'm too old for this, for love, for starting over." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Love has no age, Eleanor. Only hearts that forget how to feel." The simplicity of his words pierced every wall she'd built, but old insecurities run deep. Over the next few days, she began to avoid him, convincing herself it was for the best. She told herself he deserved someone younger, someone who could give him a long future. She was wrong, and she knew it. One Sunday morning, Eleanor walked past the park and saw Daniel sitting alone on the bench, his hands clasped, his shoulders tense. Noah wasn't there. Something in her chest tightened. She hesitated, but her heart refused to let her walk away. She sat beside him and asked softly, "Daniel, what happened?" He looked up, eyes red and tired. "It's Noah. He's in the hospital. Asthma attack. It was bad." Eleanor's breath caught. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. That single gesture said everything words couldn't. That night, Eleanor stayed by Daniel's side at the hospital. The sterile white walls felt cold, but his trembling hand and hers anchored them both to something real. Nurses rushed in and out. Machines beeped softly, and rain whispered against the windows. When the doctor finally said Noah was stable, Daniel exhaled a breath that seemed to carry years of fear. He covered his face, shoulders shaking, not just from relief, but from exhaustion, from the unbearable weight of almost losing the only family he had left. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply moved closer, resting her hand on his shoulder, staying there until his breathing steadied. In that quiet, she realized that love didn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it came in the soft presence of someone who refused to leave when everything fell apart. Days passed. Eleanor brought Daniel coffee each morning, read aloud from children's books to Noah, and stayed late when Daniel needed rest. Nurses began to recognize her, smiling knowingly as she walked the hallway with gentle determination. When Noah finally opened his eyes, pale but smiling, his first words were a whisper, "Dad, did Miss Eleanor come?" Daniel's eyes filled instantly. He nodded, smiling through tears. She never left Buddy. Eleanor's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. She looked at Daniel, and in that moment, they both understood this wasn't friendship anymore. It was love, quiet, steady, and rooted in something deeper than attraction. It was built from kindness and shared pain, the kind of love that doesn't rush, but holds you steady when life feels fragile. When Noah returned home a week later, Daniel invited Eleanor to dinner as a simple thank you. She almost refused, afraid that crossing that invisible line would change everything. But she couldn't say no, not when Noah had drawn a little invitation card himself, complete with doodles of spaghetti and smiling faces. That evening, Daniel's home felt warm in a way Eleanor hadn't felt in years. The smell of garlic and basil filled the air, the sound of Noah's laughter bouncing off the walls. It wasn't a fancy dinner, just homemade pasta, mismatched plates, and 3 people who somehow felt like a family. Noah proudly showed her his latest sketches. One was of her and Daniel sitting together on their park bench. "You look happy there," he said innocently. Eleanor smiled, her eyes watering. She had spent so many years convincing herself that happiness was something she'd already had her share of, that she was too old, too late, too afraid. But sitting there, listening to the soft hum of a home that wasn't hers, but somehow felt like it, she realized how wrong she'd been. When the night ended and the dishes were done, Daniel walked her to the door. The air outside was crisp, stars breaking through the lingering clouds. She turned to him and whispered, almost apologetically, "I can't do this. I don't want to be a burden. You deserve someone who can give you years, not memories." Daniel stood there for a long moment, silent. Then, softly, he said, "Eleanor, Laura once told me that love doesn't choose the strongest or the youngest. It chooses the bravest. He stepped closer, his eyes warm and steady. You're the bravest person I know. The words slipped past every wall she had built, every excuse she had clung to. Something broke inside her, not in pain, but in release. For years, she had thought she was protecting herself from heartbreak, but in truth, she had been protecting herself from happiness. That night, when she walked home, the streets glistened with rain again, but it felt different this time. The same city that once felt too big, too lonely, now felt alive. She could almost hear her heart whispering, "It's not too late." Weeks turned into months. Spring crept gently into Portland, replacing gray skies with bursts of cherry blossoms. Eleanor and Daniel began to share their days as naturally as breathing. They met for coffee in the mornings before work, walked to the park on weekends, and sometimes simply sat together in silence, content, unhurried, unafraid. Noah, ever the artist, began filling his sketchbook with drawings of the three of them together, at the library, at the park, at home. One page showed Eleanor reading while Daniel dozed on the couch, and Noah colored on the floor. At the bottom, in crooked letters, he had written "My family." When she saw it, Eleanor's breath caught. She had never imagined that word could belong to her again. One afternoon, as they walked to the park, Daniel suddenly stopped. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. He turned to her with that same gentle smile that had first melted her defenses months ago. "You still think you're too old for love?" he asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I think love was just waiting for me to grow into it." Daniel laughed softly and took her hand, their fingers fitting together like they'd always belonged. Noah ran ahead, his sketchbook bouncing against his side, laughter echoing through the air. They walked on in silence, hearts light, the past no longer heavy. For the first time in decades, Eleanor didn't feel like she was waiting for life to happen. She was living it. Months later, sitting at that same cafe where it all began, Eleanor watched the rain fall again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Daniel sat across from her, reading the newspaper, while Noah sketched another rainy day masterpiece. The boy looked up and grinned, holding out his new drawing. It was of the three of them, together, smiling. She smiled back through misty eyes. "You've got your father's heart," she said softly. Daniel reached across the table, brushing his fingers against hers. "And I think I've got yours." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but instead of loneliness, it sounded like music now. Love, she realized, doesn't vanish with time. It doesn't fade with wrinkles or years. It waits quietly, patient and steady, for courage to open the door again. Sometimes it finds us under gray skies and falling rain. Sometimes in a small coffee shop when we least expect it. And sometimes love doesn't come to start over. It comes to remind us that our story was never over to begin with. If this story touched your heart, remember, love doesn't come with a deadline. It doesn't belong only to the young. It belongs to anyone brave enough to believe again. So, like Eleanor, let your heart stay open, because even after the rain, the sun always finds its way home. Cloud with rain, red heart,